Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and I'm going to give you the last round of Ascendancy changes and revamps. It's about 5 or 6 of them here to go, and a few kind of big ones, a few didn't really change, and overall that's basically it for the Ascendancy revamps after this video. A lot of them have been completely shaken up, and it means we should have a lot of extra fun throughout this new league to just try a bunch of different combos, different ascendancies with different skills, and it's just a pretty big shake-up overall from the previous layout we've been very used to for quite a while now. So I'll try and bum rush through them because there is quite a lot of information in some of them, and I'm just going to try and summarize them as much as I can. But yeah, here we go, strap in. So kicking things off with Inquisitor, one that we kind of predicted would get a bit of a nerf potentially because it is and has been a forerunner in the elemental category for both attack builds and mostly spellcaster builds. So we thought something would happen, but overall, nothing really changed. Just one little change here, and that is Sanctify. So the Consecrated Ground effect node that spawns Consecrated Ground everywhere. Now you spawn more of it, even more everywhere. It's got 10% chance to create Consecrated Ground when you hit a rare or unique enemy lasting 8 seconds. So it's just a much more reliable form of Consecrated Ground spreading all over the place, which is, you know, enabling a bunch of good things from Sanctify and Pious Path. And for this sort of character that goes low life or energy shield based and uses sustain from Pious Path, it is pretty good, and that is just a small bit of quality of life. As well as that, there was immune to elemental ailments while on Consecrated Ground as opposed to being unaffected. Just a slight change in wording there, which does change a couple of things. But overall, basically nothing happened. Inquisitor still really good, and it is a bit confusing because there's essentially no reason to take Elementalist over Inquisitor for elemental builds, but there is potentially some reason to take Scion instead, which we'll go into just a bit later. Following on from that is Gladiator, which wasn't so much a revamp as more of a shake-up, like similar to a Slayer, for example. A bunch of things just got moved around a bit, and it's changed the way you're going to be picking points on Gladiator just a bit. A lot of people are very unhappy about this. I think it's still okay and it's still usable, but there are choices you have to make in the build compared to what you otherwise may have previously. So we'll start off with the left-hand side, which is the defensive stuff. So 1 and 2 just gives you the block and attack speed, and then 8 additional block if you were damaged by a hit recently, 40 damage if you've taken no damage from hits recently, and then cannot be stunned by hits you block, which isn't a big deal, but it does help a bit. A lot of the time you get plenty of block stun recovery anyway, doesn't really matter. And then your counterattacks deal double damage. Now counterattacks are things like Vengeance and Reckoning. They are fine, and this will make that type of meme a bit more readily available and usable, but for the most part they're unnecessary in the game at the moment, I think, and not really something you build around anyway. However, people will definitely push this to the limits, and it is a bit of a nice node for that. Then you have 3 and 4, which is still 100% chance, block chance applied to spells, nothing changed there. 7 and 8, that got a bit of a boost. So we have Violent Retaliation. 4% to max block chance, so currently it's 75% max block chance. That means it would be 79, and then you can get a bit more from amulet slots as well. So 79 with this node, it's not too bad, but I personally never went for max block chance as a Gladiator. I'd hit something like 50 or 60 at most, and that felt tanky enough anyway. Then you have 8% increased physical damage for each hit you've blocked in the past 10 seconds, 80% increased physical damage if you blocked a hit from a unique enemy in the past 10 seconds, which should be reliable enough against bigger, tougher enemies, but this one over here, probably not going to happen or use too much. But 80% phys, nothing to sneeze at, and you should be blocking things from unique enemies just about always. And then 1% additional block chance for each hit you've blocked in the past 10 seconds. Once again, not really too sure how practical that is. So I think for the most part you're taking this node because you want to be really defensive, 4 max block chance and then 80% damage to kind of give you better damage when you've taken all that defense. Not a big fan of this node still. I personally probably won't be taking it much, if ever, but it was boosted a bit to be less useless than it was before. We then have 5 and 6, which is Outmatch and Outlast. It's a node I almost always take on my Gladiators and does feel really good. It's a bunch more phys damage while it max frenzies and generates you some frenzies and endurance charges potentially. Hasn't been changed at all, so that's fine. It's still pretty good. 9 and 10, 11, 12. So this is where the shakeup mostly occurred. We have 9 and 10 now has attacks have a 25% chance to cause bleeding. That's fine, hasn't changed. Attacks maim on hit against bleeding enemies, so that's now guaranteed against bleeding enemies, which will be just about always. So perma maim on hit, 10% chance to blind on with hits against bleeding enemies, which is, I think, a pretty damn nice node. Blind is very valuable, and 10% chance with the right builds will be up 100% of the time. So that's pretty big defensive boost for the character. And then enemies maimed by you take 10% increased physical damage. So that's basically going to be a 10% more multiplier to your damage effects. And as well as that, maim still reduces some movement speed. And the blind is nothing to sneeze at, though plenty of people do get blind from other sources, and Abyssal Jewels were a very easy one this league. Not sure how readily available they will be this league, but or this new league, but Stib Knights are fine too. Overall, it's not too good. Previously, you would take this node primarily for the bleed explosions, which you now have to invest 4 points into, because it's now at gratuitous violence. So it says attacks have 25% chance to cause bleeding. That's fine, still a total of 50%. 30% increased damage with hits and ailments against bleeding enemies. Bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 10% of their max life as physical damage. So this used to be down here for the 2 points. The explosion from bleeds, which was a large part of taking Gladiator. For the explosions, the feels good, the additional clear speed that they then provided. And then lastly, 25% more damage with bleeding. So as I thought, Gladiator was going to be more of a bleed-centric ascendancy, where if you really want to go for the bleed damage, which is, from what I've heard, possible. Haven't personally tried it myself because it hasn't looked good enough, but possible to do pure bleed damage and focus on that. This would just make it even better, just quite a bit nicer with the 25% more damage with bleeding. However, it's not the greatest thing to then have to spend 4 points to get the bleed explosions. And besides that, if you're not actually investing into any sort of bleed damage, it's a pretty weak node after that, because you don't really get anything. It's just replacing a glove slot, which is hemophilia gloves, and spending another 2 points, which is going to be sacrificing a lot in most cases. For the most part, as your Gladiator characters, you want these 2 points for Outmatch and Outlast for your damage, and then these 4 to get the spell block and block, and then you'd probably go these 2 for the bleed explosions. That has been traditional. So now you would probably still do that unless you want some more defensive shit, or to go strictly into the bleed damage stuff, or actual bleed damage. It becomes a bit awkward, and you don't really want these as the last 2. They're not bad, but they're not amazing. But you don't want to go for the bleed explosions and sacrifice something like the spell block or the damage. So it does become a bit awkward. I still see it seeing use personally. I think it's still a fairly all-round ascendancy, good defense, good offense. But making these choices is now a lot harder and leaves you feeling less satisfied. I think you could probably still get away with just doing the usual shit, grabbing that, and that, and then wearing hemophilia gloves for a similar effect. But if that's worth it compared to other characters, since you could also slap hemophilias on those other characters, is where the question ends up coming into. So yeah, a bit of an interesting one. Like I said, still see some use. Gonna have to wait and see what happens with things like Champion for the Taunt and Intimidate, and then I'll make more decisions based off that. Next up, we have Saboteur. It's a ascendancy I haven't really played too much of, basically ever. I've done one Saboteur before, and that's because I was playing traps, and it made sense to make Saboteur for the trapping character, because there is a lot of quality of life to make traps worthwhile there. Likewise with mines, there's a lot of quality of life here that Saboteur is worth doing, and there was a decent little buff here. So we'll start with the minor nodes here. So 1 and 2 is now Pyromaniac, which is a fairly hefty node. You have immune to ignite, immune to shock, nothing too insignificant there. 1% life regenerated per second for each of your mines detonated recently, up to 20%, and you can detonate mines pretty quickly, pretty reliably, so that is a lot of extra regen going to be coming in just out of nowhere for quality of life. 1% life regenerated per second for traps triggered recently, up to 20%. So similarly, you can throw plenty of traps, and you'll probably be maintaining something like 5 to 10% life regen per second a lot of the time, and I think that's a good little defensive bonus. So this node overall feels pretty good, I think. As well as that, you get 25% reduced mana cost of skills that place mines or throw traps. And the mana cost on both mine and traps is usually pretty high, so getting a 25% reduced mana cost of those skills seems like it should be a nice little quality of life as well. Overall, it seems like it's probably going to be a staple in a lot of these mind trapping setups that do take Saboteur. After that, we move into 7 and 8 over here, so that is Born in the Shadows. Now, this one's pretty nifty. It has Cannot Be Blinded, pretty insignificant for a Saboteur-based character, because it doesn't matter if you're blinded or not, you're never really attacking to try and hit things, so that's fairly insignificant. 10 reduced damage taken from blinded enemies, which is a decent little damage defensive boost against enemies, and nearby enemies are blinded. The nearby enemies blinded means you're just going to have a radius, an aura around your character, constantly blinding things, which is really quite strong. Blind, if you're unaware, halves the enemy's chance to hit, so they have 50% less chance to hit you, and that being up all the time against everything is fairly strong defensively. You then also have 30% increased damage with hits and ailments against blinded enemies, a little bit of damage, and 25% chance to blind enemies on hit, which shouldn't be too significant because nearby enemies are blinded anyway. Now, it is really nice. It is just a really good node. It's not particularly something you can't get elsewhere. Like I said, blind can happen in other situations, and Stibnite Flask. But just for these two nodes, if you got nothing else to grab, I think that does end up being really defensive. Or if you're just really into surviving more, which not particularly for me, yeah, nearby enemies are blinded is actually really quite strong. Then we move on to 13-14, and that is Explosive Expert. 20% increased area effect, 20% increased area damage. Damage penetrates 10% Ellie, and 10% reduced damage taken from traps and mines. Didn't change very much, overall stayed roughly the same, and it's still something you're going to be taking pretty much all of those, I think. So for me personally, I'm probably taking this one and Pyromaniac if I'm going to play this stuff, because Born in the Shadows just doesn't seem quite strong enough for me for things that I'm going to be tackling anyway. But this got changed a bit from you don't really get physical fire damage, which you had 10% before, so that got changed to just area damage, I think, and a bit of area effect. After that, looking at the entire trapping area, that's 9 through to 12 up here, not a lot changed. You gained in total 10% cooldown recovery speed for throwing traps. Previously you got 40% total, now you get 50%. You also gained an additional 10% chance to trigger your traps an additional time, so that's, you know, doubling it. That's not too bad. Still only 1 in 5 chance of triggering an additional trap. And besides that, I think you gained a bit of damage. And yeah, it's still something you're absolutely taking as a trapper to be able to get your nearby traps also trigger if you're playing Saboteur especially. And the 50 cooldown recovery. I mean, there's less reason to take Saboteur these days because you can get a lot of what Saboteur offers elsewhere, but it is still a one-stop shop for trapping specs, and it is still decent. So it wasn't hugely changed or buffed, but this node over here for the regen I think is the strongest thing. As far as mines are concerned, it's still the same thing as far as I could tell, just about unchanged, just mine quality of life. And I haven't really played any mine builds, so I couldn't give you too much expertise in that, but I don't think it's been too shook up. Now, another Ascendancy I don't play too much of or know terribly much about, because all around summoning, I don't really like doing that, is Necro, and it did get a bit of a rework. This is kind of a revamp in that sense of the word. Starting with 1 and 2, I don't think there were many changes there, still just auras and aura buffs and all that. 9 and 10 over here is Puppet Master, so that's just a nice minion node that I think got combined with a few other things, not much of an expertise there either. 11, 12 is Mistress of Sacrifice, that's kind of one of the biggest changes here. You now have offering skills still affect you, but they have a 50% reduced effect on you, which is still good. They still do quite a hefty amount of things to you, but 50% reduced effect is pretty substantial, and people said that apparently it was needed and warranted, because you can get way too much shit from Necro defensively and just make a bit of a beast character without really needing too much from your gear. So apparently that's necessary, and it does kind of kill, I think, largely Scourge-based attack characters. Gives you less reason to do Scourge and build around that sort of shit, so that is kind of a shame. But there is still a bit of a damage buff there, and 2 attack and cast speed for each corpse consumed recently, which, yeah, I mean, you're consuming, what, like 5 at a time? Probably not anything too huge, but overall it was a nerf. Then we do have kind of an interesting way to build the Ascendancy now, where you take 2 points, which is general minion stuff, 3 and 4. You get a bunch of minion quality of life there for attack, life, whatever, and cooldown of Convocation Recovery, which is pretty nice. And then you pick what you want for your specialty, and that is zombies, skeletons, or specters, sorry. I was going to say scepters. So specters, just pretty bland, flat life, flat damage, but the whole interesting part of specters is which ones you pick and what you support them with, and lots of different specters out there, so that's the interesting part there. You just get a bunch of extra damage and life for them, make them better. The zombie nodes actually look pretty beefy, so you do have 2 additional number of zombies, 1% additional fizz reduction for each zombie you own, which I think was the previous node, basically just that. Now you also get 2 max number of zombies. Your raised zombies spread caustic cloud on death, dealing 50% of their max life as chaos damage per second, and you can get quite a lot of life on your zombies, so that's actually quite a lot of extra damage potential over there. On death though, I'm not sure how often they die. I don't know fuck all about zombies. And then Raised Zombies Slam has 100% increased area effect and 100% cooldown recovery speed, so that makes it seem like zombies should actually be a really strong thing to build around as a summoner, and I may actually have to look into this for the first time ever, because it doesn't sound too bad, to be honest. It does not sound all that bad. And then we're given another new node in the skeleton stuff, so Bone Sculptor, 2 to max number of skeletons, summon skeletons hits can't be evaded, which is a really nice offensive buff, 100% increased skeleton movement speed. Apparently they're still pretty slow, but 100% increase should make it a bit better. And then 2 additional skeleton warriors are summoned with summon skeleton, and they deal 40% increased damage. If you're into the skeleton stuff, that all seems pretty big and rather good. Like I said, don't specialize in any of this. Probably gonna have to look elsewhere to see exactly how to feel about this and exactly what it means. But those are the changes, and it seems like it's been more of a specialized tree for your summoners now, so you have to kind of pick which way you want to go and what you're going to use. And now we come to the last 2 ascendancies, and potentially the biggest, the Jug, and it basically became, well, yeah, a juggernaut. It really does lend itself to its name. It's fairly beefy, it's got better attack than before, it's just an all-round ascendancy buff from what I can tell, and we start from the top of Undeniable. Previously, it was just 1000 accuracy and this additional accuracy per attack rating, accuracy rating. You now get 30% increased accuracy rating if you've dealt a crit in the past 8 seconds. Should be up all the time. 30% increased damage if you've dealt a crit in the past 8 seconds as well, like I said, all the time. And then you also gain accuracy rating equal to your strength. So that's actually a really nice buff. An additional 30% when you're trying to stack accuracy is quite a lot, because typically you'd probably be grabbing something like 100-150% from the tree, I would say. Another 30% is quite a lot on top of that. And then gain accuracy rating equal to your strength is fairly huge. If you don't really do any strength stacking and you just grab this and then stack accuracy from different sources, then you're probably looking at having something like 400 or 500 strength anyway, so it's another 400 or 500 accuracy just out of nowhere. If you go really hard with the accuracy stacking and the strength stacking, realistically you can hit strength to about 1000 without trying too hard, about 1200-1300 if you try pretty hard, and then about 1400-1500 if you just go out of your mind trying to get all the strength you can. So you can definitely stack a lot of accuracy with this now, and it makes the appeal of an Obscurantis and an Oscam stacking Juggernaut just that much easier and that much more appealing. Like, you're going to be pretty realistically, if you try, getting 20-30,000 accuracy, and that with Oscams gives you a lot of extra crit, a lot of extra attack speed, and then Obscurantis, that's only really if you're going projectile-based stuff, but it's a pretty interesting mechanic and thing to build around, and it just got way better. You then have Unstoppable. I don't think that really changed, and it's not a huge deal because you can get just about everything from that on Combs Roots, but it is nice if you have spare points for it. You then have Unbreakable. That got changed up a little bit, so 2% of life regenerated per second, just a flat 2%. 5% reduced damage taken. Armor received from body armor is doubled, so that is quite typically the reason you're going Jug, because it's really tanky, and that's a very good way to mitigate an Abyssus largely, or just stack a shitload of armor. So this one's pretty much always going to be a given to take. You then also have 1.5% of total physical damage prevented from hits in the past 10 seconds is then regenerated as life per second. I'm not too sure how actually useful that is. I think it's just kind of an additional perk thrown in on top of everything. It really depends on how much you're going to be taking and how much you're going to be preventing to actually give you much life regen, but I'm not too sure it's even going to be terribly reliable or factor into the defenses and the regen of your build, but it could be something nice just as an additional little perk. Overall, just a slightly better node than it was before, so it should be a bit tankier than previously. And that's the minor nodes. We then get to the major ones that have a branching. 7 and 8. So we start here, unflinching. You will now be gaining a 30% chance to gain an endurance charge when you are hit. That could be pretty reliable for endurance charge generation, but you would also have 25% chance that if you would gain an endurance charge, you instead gain up to your maximum number of endurance charges. So if you can get up to 8, for example, because there's +1 here, you take all the ones on the tree. Let's say you can get 8. If you have 0, 25% chance that on the first hit you get hit on that 30% chance, you could go straight up to 8. So that's been put into the first 2 points, whereas I think it used to be a 4-point sort of thing. But then you also gain endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. So you're going to be getting hit plenty. You're not that block based, I don't think. Typically, as a Jug, you're running Fortify and Armor and Regen and all that shit. You get hit quite reliably, and you will have an endurance charge coming into your character every second. And you're going to be getting hit plenty. So recently, it's past 4 seconds. Quite often, you will just be constantly going up on your endurance charges if you have 0 from an Immortal Call usage, a discharge if you want to go that way. And it's just going to resustain those, and every endurance charge you get every second has a 25% chance to coat to maximum. So you could have your 8-second Immortal Call proc, have 0, and then it's going to start ticking straight back up. You could go back up to 8 immediately. This shit's actually pretty nuts, and the synergy there, the combo, just means endurance charge sustain is going to be crazy, and that makes your Jug way thicker than before, and just so much more sustainable, I think. So these 2 points, very useful, and you're definitely grabbing because you have to. There's nothing else to grab at that point. But then you have a choice of either going 9, 10 or 11, 12. One's a bit more defensive, one's a bit more offensive. So 9, 10 up here is unyielding, 5% increased damage, 5% increased area, and let's just assume you stack them and you have 8, so that's 40% damage, 40% area. Without investing any on the tree, 40% area, that's pretty hefty. But if you're getting the 8th endurance charge, you're up in Templar, you're potentially getting the area anyway, but that is a nice little bit of area to attach to your Jug. 25% chance to gain endurance charge when you stun an enemy, and 10% increased stun duration on enemies per endurance charge. So if you have 80% stun duration thanks to your 8 endurance charges, then it's a bit of extra stun. Don't know if that's really going to factor in, and that extra chance when you stun an enemy, yeah, I mean, maybe it'll factor in, but I think you get everything you need from unflinching. Maybe an Enduring Cry if you really want to have that extra safety. So not too sure about the viability of that, but the damage and area isn't too bad. And then lastly, if you want to go more defensive, you get Unrelenting. That's down here. 1% additional physical damage taken per endurance charge. Sorry, damage reduction per endurance charge. So it could be a potential 8, let's say. 8 reduced elemental damage taken while at max endurance charges, pretty good. And then 4 to chaos resistance per endurance charge, which ends up being, a pretty large amount, let's say 32 if you have 8 of them. So it's just a big defensive node. I'm not sure I'll be taking it too often, but overall, just looking at the whole picture, you can go more offensive than ever before. And if you've looked at my previous Jug character, Glacial Hammer, didn't really need more offense, but this does help and makes it a bit easier. It also is just way easier to mitigate something like an Abyssus. So the synergy of your crit characters, Juggernaut and Abyssus, is just off this world. Get an Abyssus should be really easy to sustain, and that gives you a huge amount of damage to your characters. there are plenty of things you're going to be doing with the Jug, with the accuracy. I think overall this is a strong example of yet another good Ascendancy revamp, and I'd say the masses are pretty excited to do it, especially with the new skill that came out just now, Tectonic Strike, but we'll look at that in another video. And lastly, I'm going to go over the Ascendant, the Scion specialization. There's a lot to do here. Just about everything had a little tweak or so, and some were fairly big tweaks. Overall, Ascendant looks like it will be, I'd say, more viable than it used to be. There's a few more options. Some of them are still pretty dumpster, and I think you'll be avoiding them regardless, but some of them are really nice, and maybe even taking, it feels like they're taking some of the better things from their respective ascendancies than they used to, and more of the defining characteristics of those ascendancies. So start with Occultist, and that has enemies have 1 additional curse. That's a really nice thing to get. 10% increased effect of your curses, 1.5% energy shield regenerated per second, and cannot be stunned while you have energy shield. So that's for your CI low life characters, some stun immune. You get an additional curse without having to travel all the way up to the Occultist area, witch area, but you may want to do that anyway, so 3 curses just out of nowhere like that. And it doesn't have the minus chaos res node anymore, so it's not strictly tied to essence drain or pure chaos things. It can be more hybridized and used in plenty of others and other combos with different ascendancies. That's a really sort of nifty and nice little perk you get from the ascendancy of the Occultist now. The Elementalist one was made a lot better and overall kind of looks better than the Elementalist itself somehow. It isn't, obviously. Elementalist itself gets a lot more stuff, but it has taken a lot of the nice things from that node, from the Ascendancy, and that is damage penetrates 10% of enemy LE resistances, cannot take reflected LE damage. That doesn't really mean too much usually. 40 increased effect of Herald on you, probably won't be too substantial overall as a pure buff to your character. Shocks from your hits always increase damage taken by at least 10%. So quite often you won't really be shocking things for any substantial amount, whereas this will always give you at least 10%, so you can call that a 10% damage buff, and you get an additional golem at a time. That is just overall a slight boost over the previous ascendancy of Elementalist from the Scion, and it was already used before. I know I did plenty of times, so it's just a little bit better, and there is some good synergy there when we get to it for Inquisitor. So overall, a pretty useful one. We then have Necro, which gets the offering skills also affect you, and a bit of the other skill duration minion damage. And of course, you also get 50% reduced effect of those offerings, but you do actually get that offering affecting you just from purely taking half an ascendancy, that is Necro on the Scion. You also get Auras grant 3% increased attack and cast speed to you and allies, which means you can make a bit of an aura bot if you want as a Scion. Chieftain was given a bit of a rework and actually looks fairly nice now. 2% of life regen per second, 10% increased strength, 1% of damage dealt by your totems is leached to you as life. So if you take that as a, let's say, melee character, get a War Chief totem, and a lot of the time you place your War Chief, you got to run around a bit, that thing's going to be leeching for you and doing some pretty good leech at that. So 1% of damage dealt by your totems leached as life to you. Very strong node there, and it's got some real good synergy with the Hierophant if you want to go pure totems there, get lots of leech. It's a lot of extra sustain to your character and added safety overall because you're just placing totems and running around like a girl anyway, so that does help quite a lot. 10% chance to cover rare or unique enemies in Ash for 10 seconds on hit, so that just gives them less movement speed and 20% increased fire damage taken, which you can imagine is just a plain 20% fire damage boost in a lot of cases for your pure fire totem and non-totem like characters. That's pretty nice as well. The Ash on hit should be a reliable buff, and it's a pretty strong little half ascendancy. Berserker is kind of just bad. It kept some of the old stuff from the previous Berserker and then added a couple others in the form of Rage, but it's all when you kill an enemy, so it's still Leech and Mana Leech when you kill an enemy, and then gain Rage when you kill an enemy, and that just feels bad for a lot of situations where you either have to carry a Worm Flask or a Val Breach, or just not get the benefit of your Ascendancy against those bosses and stuff. So I don't really like all of that, but yeah, if you can sustain your Rage, and kill plenty of enemies. It's fairly decent, but it's probably one of the least used ones, I'd say, still at this stage. We then have Juggernaut, which is 1,000 to accuracy rating, cannot be chilled, cannot be stunned, which isn't too bad. Pure cannot be stunned from an Ascendancy. Plenty of builds would like that as just a half Ascendancy, as well as the 1,000 accuracy. 5% increased damage per endurance charge, and gain an endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. But it's that endurance charge sustain from the Jug class or Ascendancy, and it is a pretty good one. So this one should see some use, especially when comboed with a couple of other of the Ascendancies out there. It's not a bad one at all. Bunch of accuracy, can't be stunned, and endurance charge sustain, which is pretty defensive. Because a lot of characters don't really want to focus on endurance charges, but this one just gives you autopilot ones quite a lot of the time. Then have the Templar area, and we run to Guardian, which basically reads as Aurabot stuff. I'm not really going to go too much into that. I don't focus on Aurabots, and it is taking some of the niftier things from the Guardian spec and just giving them to you in Ascendancy Scion Ascendant form, that's just pure Aurabot shit. Then I have the Inquisitor, which is 30 to crit strike multi against enemies that are affected by Ellie ailments. Should be up pretty much all the time, so 30 crit multi, 6% pen on Ellie resists, and 10% chance to create Consecrated Ground when you hit a rare or unique enemy lasting 8 seconds. You're immune to elemental ailments while on Consecrated Ground, which is really quite nice as a defensive and quality of life sort of thing. And you should have your Consecrated Ground up all of the time, which is an additional 4% regen, I believe. And then nearby enemies take 10% increased early damage. So that's a 10% boost across the board, basically. So as I was saying, it's kind of really good synergy just off the bat with an Elementalist. You get 16% Ellie pen, a bunch of extra damage from your Herald, bit of extra multi over here, the Consecrated Ground for defense and all that. Another 10% damage there, 10% damage there, so total should be at least 20% damage. It seems like it's got some good synergy there, and then you can plan around your passive tree all over the place with the Witch start, the Templar start, the Scion start, and getting like 5 extra passives or so. So it's probably more tempting than an Elementalist just for a pure Ellie build at this stage anyway. Seems pretty good to have some strong synergy there for elemental builds. You then have Hierophant, and the major thing is it lost power charge sustain off of dropping totems, so that's kind of a big deal. But you now have 1 additional totem summoned at a time. Previously it was only if those were socketed in a helm, so this is a pretty big buff for that, meaning you can just get an additional totem on top of the additional totem from the passive tree. That's at least 3 totems for this one character for only half an ascendancy there. Damage taken from mana before life, 8%. Gain Arcane Surge whenever your totems hit an enemy with a spell, you or your totems, and then 20% increased damage while you have Arcane Surge. So it should be Perma Arcane Surge, which, as I've mentioned in a previous video, I don't think that's a big deal, but it is fairly quality of life and nice to just have it all the time. But I don't think a huge deal because it's not that hard to get Arcane Surge otherwise. Then looking at Shadow, we have Trickster, 15% chance to gain a Frenzy charge and power charge on kill. So could be nice for mapping and all that, but you'll still have to figure it out for actual bosses and all that yourself. The regen rate of life, mana, and energy shield after you've killed recently for damage over time effects. Still roughly the same, I think. May have been 40 before, now 50. Can't really remember, but still useful there. Your hits have a 15% chance to gain 50% of non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage. So average that out. That is roughly, what, 7.5%, I think, actual more chaos damage, let's just say, to your hits. Nothing too big. It's not really that big compared to the actual Trickster Ascendancy itself. So they just took a real minor bit of that, and it's okay, but I'm not sure you're really going to ever be relying on this for damage as a half Ascendancy. Cannot be stunned if you've been hit recently, and 15 mana regen per second if you haven't been hit recently, right? Yeah. So for the first hit, you just won't get stunned, and then 15 mana regen per second if you used a movement skill recently, which should be up just about all the time, so it's a free additional clarity. That's a fairly large amount of extra sustain, and you could potentially still see some use from Trickster comboed with Occultist, for example, to get Essence Drain or Scorching Ray. But overall, looking at this, I don't think you really do Trickster Occultist previously like I did as a Scion. I don't think you really do that anymore for Essence Drain or Scorching Ray. I'd say both Occultist and Trickster just by themselves as actual ascendancies fit that theme more. So previously, yep, I took Scion and it was a good option. Now, I'm not too sure. I feel like just the actual ascendancies are going to be better for those purposes. So that's kind of up to your own interpretation, but that's my offhand look at it. Assassin just got a nerf. Don't know why, really. From 1.5% crit to 1% crit chance. So that's a pretty decent little nerf there. You now have 10% chance to gain power charge on crit, which is nice. That's better power charge sustain, I think, at this point. 40% chance to poison on hit. Don't know why that's there. That's completely useless. You're never going to be building a poison character as a Scion, I don't think. Just could not possibly compete compared to actual Assassin or Trickster. So really not sure what you're doing with that. Movement speed, if you've killed recently, sure, that's kind of nice, but who cares? It's kind of small. And then damage from crit strikes cannot be reflected, which isn't really anything you care about for the most part anyway. Seems weak at this point. You're probably not taking it almost ever compared to some of these other nicer ascendancies. And then Saboteur, which is really weird. Yeah, it was reworked. It's got now area, 6% pen. It's got the life regen mods and 25% chance to blind on hit. Doesn't really feel like a trap thing at all. So this just feels weird. Have the regen, but you're probably never building a Scion Trapper for any purpose because you just don't get enough out of it. It just doesn't make any sense, I don't think. So you might take this for some other ascendancies, to be honest. For some other classes or specs, I mean, just for 6% Ellie pen, 30% area, 25% blind. Probably not, since it's weaker than a lot of the others, but I don't really understand what this thing's doing. It's just, it doesn't have a real trap identity compared to the rest of the tree, compared to Saboteur itself, and there's just a bit of random trap stuff here. It feels kind of weird, not too sure what to think about that. It's just out of place, I think. Then getting to second to last, that's Duelist. We're looking at Slayer. Now has Culling Strike, so just a 10% cull, which isn't too hard to get elsewhere, but it is nice if you don't really feel like doing that, which I never do. So just 10% damage you can treat that as. 20% increased damage while leeching. Life leech effects are not removed at full life, so that's what it previously had. 20% increased area of effect if you've killed recently, which is okay. And then cannot take reflected physical damage, just lets you run Phys Reflect maps. So previously you did actually see some use of Slayer from Ascendant for the life leech effects, not removed at full life, because it's a really nice quality of life for certain characters and just playstyle. You also now get a Culling Strike, so that's not too bad at all. But it's going to rely on what we see with the leech changes and mechanics, because they said that it is going to be kind of changed so that Slayer just doesn't have its own pure overleech mechanic compared to everything else. So if that changes, maybe this won't be as good, and we'll have to wait and see for that. But in its current stage, in our current game, that's a nice buff and looks pretty nice. Champion has 10% chance to fortify on melee hit, which, as I've mentioned, is kind of okay, but not too special, because you really can get fortify, especially as a melee thingo, quite easily in plenty of situations. So not particularly necessary. Enemies you taunt take 10% increased damage and 25% chance to taunt on hit. As I mentioned, that's only really going to factor in too well if the taunt immunity of something like Shaper goes away and taunt resistance of some other things goes away too. But let's just say it does. 10% increased damage taken, so that's pretty nice. Your hits permanently intimidate enemies that are on full life, which is another 10% increased damage taken. So a potential of 20% increased damage taken. And then you and nearby allies have 8% movement speed, which isn't too significant, nothing to really look into there. This could be good, I think, could potentially see some use, potentially 20% damage taken from a lot of things. So, you know, this one looks all right at this stage. Gladiator, I'm not too sure how to feel about this one. It feels kind of weird. You get 50% of block chance applied to spells, 3 to max block chance, 25% chance cause to bleed, which is really neither here nor there, doesn't do much. 10% chance to blind with hits against bleeding enemies. So I guess that could be a reliable enough bleeding hit blinding thing for defense, but feels kind of weak and awkward. And then 15% more damage with bleeding. Chances are you're not building a Scion, I don't think anyway, for pure bleed damage, so I'm really not sure what you're going to be doing with this. I do not see Gladiator getting much use in its current form. Maybe though, beats the fuck out of me. I just don't, this doesn't excite me one bit. Then moving on to Ranger, the last one. Holy shit, we're almost there. I'm dying. Pathfinder, so this got kind of reworked. It did take some of the key and really nicest things from the Pathfinder, so I think this one's pretty good. 10% increased movement speed during any flask, 10% attack speed during any flask effect. Flasks gain 3 charges every 3 seconds, which is the new mod from the Pathfinder. That's a lot of extra flask sustain and regeneration, especially in downtime between certain fights. Damage penetrates 6% of Ellie resists, as opposed to the 10 from the actual Pathfinder, and 15% chance for your flasks to not consume charges. So overall, this is one of the, I think, ones that did take the most from the actual Ascendancy and some of the nicer things. The largest reason to use Pathfinder is really to get flask sustain and solid reliable flask sustain, and it took the charges regen, it took the non-consuming. The only real difference is you don't have the additional chance to get charges from status ailment things, and the 20% flask effect, slight bit of duration as well from the actual minor nodes. So I think this comboed with a few others, if you really want to focus on flasks, is actually pretty solid, and took a lot of the good things that maybe mean you don't necessarily need Pathfinder anymore when you want to focus more on flasks, because you still get a lot of the good things, and then you can pick another Ascendancy from a Scion, as well as another area to start from, and a bunch of extra passives. It's not terribly exciting, I don't think, but it is very practical, and I think you can get some use out of that. Raider hasn't actually changed, they just gained 20% increased attack damage to it. Otherwise, I don't think it changed at all. It's kind of nice, but I just barely ever see a reason to take it. I'd rather play an actual Raider or pick some other cooler things from Scion anyway. So for me personally, probably won't see much use anyway, but it is kind of useful regardless. Deadeye hasn't really changed much, except it gained 100% increased accuracy rating, which is quite a lot of accuracy rating. Still gives you the skill 5's additional projectile, still gives you the far shot mechanic, and now it also gives you moving while bleeding. Doesn't cause you to take extra damage. Kind of useless. I don't think it's going to remove the fact that you need a bleed flask, so that's whatever. But it also did lose its projectile speed. Now, Deadeye, this Ascendancy on Scion did previously see plenty of use from me, because it is fairly useful, and it's better now thanks to the accuracy rating. You get plenty of accuracy through that right hand side of the tree. 100% increased means you're not really going to have to ever worry about accuracy ever again, but there is some nice synergy with that one and with the Juggernaut one, where you could actually build quite a lot of accuracy as well, probably even similar to what the Jug itself has, but the difference is you can also get an additional projectile, and you don't get the attack speed node per accuracy, so instead you'd be building around something like Oscar's or the Obscurantis Helm. I think that combo actually makes sense though. The Deadeye Jug thing, the Jugger Eye, or Deadanaut, I don't know, whatever. So there are a few interesting new combos, I think, of the Scion tree now. Most notably, Deadeye, Slayer, let's say Juggernaut, Chieftain, Hierophant, Inquisitor, Elementalist, and Occultist from what I've seen. But overall, bit of a shake-up, some good, some bad. They tried to buff a lot of things, and it should definitely see some different use than it previously saw, I'd say, as a Scion and Ascendant. Still pretty interesting, and I still do like playing Scions because they give you so many free passives and ease of access to your passive tree. It's still, I think, a good change overall, and very competitive in some cases, maybe the best Ascendancy for some builds. But I probably won't be starting with one myself, since I want to actually try a pure Ascendancy to start with. That is a lot of Ascendancy changes. I'm actually just screwed. Holy shit. Dying. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I don't know how you can possibly do that, but shit, if that's what you want to do, enjoy it, try and enjoy it. And that's all the changes as I saw them and how I saw them. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Look forward to a few more videos in the next few days for the new league stuff, and I will see you next time.